Hey everybody, we are already live, but we are still waiting for a couple of more people to arrive. So we had more than 150 registrations for this webinar, and right now we have 16 people who joined. I'm not sure that we have to wait for everybody, but just give it a couple more minutes until everybody's there. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
I think I can, if you want to stay up here, that's fine. Otherwise, I can also put you to the other attendees. I think I'll just leave you here. You're my co-host now.
Okay. I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. I don't know if that matters.
No, that's fine. All right. We have 18 people online. I think we can slowly start. The entire session will be recorded anyways, and we'll upload it on YouTube afterwards, so that for the people who are missing this, you can just go and watch it afterwards, or because it's Friday afternoon and you want to jump out of the session halfway through, that's totally fine as well. Just go ahead and you can catch the recording later. The one note though is that at the end we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So if you have a question that you want to see answered, then you can wait until then, but actually you don't have to, because one cool thing about this webinar functionality here in Zoom is that there is a dedicated Q&A section. So you find that in your control panel from Zoom, and there you can go ahead and ask questions that I can then pick up at the end. So feel free, whenever any questions come to mind, feel free to immediately drop them into Q&A. I might already pick a couple of these during the webinar, but in general, the Q&A session is planned for the end of it. All right, then let's get started. So a warm welcome to everybody who joined here today. A couple logistics up front. So as I already mentioned, we are going to record this entire webinar and upload it afterwards. Then we're using Zoom for this workshop, for this webinar, and Zoom has a couple of nice features for webinars. For example, I already mentioned the dedicated Q&A section where you can ask questions. But then there also is another functionality that is called raise hands. And I think you should have an option to raise your hand. And if you want, you can try that out now. And it's basically a way how you can draw attention to yourselves, or for me to do a quick poll. So I already see a few people who raise their hands. So that seems to work. So it might be that I have a quick question where I just need a yes or no from you, and then I'll ask you to use that feature. Then we have another feature here, and that's called polling. We'll come to that in a bit. We also have a chat here, and the chat is something where you can talk to other attendees individually, but also to the entire group. So feel free to drop in any messages there. From my experience, running a workshop with Zoom, I probably won't be able to read the chat messages during the webinar, just because I'm mostly distracted with talking and not really following what's going on in the chat. But you as the attendees, feel free to just chat and hang out there.
I'll also keep an eye on the chat as well to hopefully answer some questions. Yep.
Perfect. So if there are any important things where you think I should really react to, or that you want to react to, Matt, in that case, you can just ping or just say something because you're here with me on stage. In fact, I think I can like turn on your video if, is that okay? Then we can probably turn it on for you. I can make you the host. Oh, okay, I'll try to make you the host. Let's see what happens. There you go.
Everybody.
Okay, but now I think I lost, or did I? Let's see. I still have access to Q&A. I'm not sure if I still see the attendees list though. I do. I'm not sure if I still can see the raised hands and the polls. Okay, like I might ask you later, Matt, to do a poll, but I think we'll work that out. Cool. And then it is possible to promote attendees on stage. So in case anybody really wants to share something with the group, then feel free to like raise that either in the chat or in the Q&A section, and then we can go ahead and promote you on stage. As for the timing of this entire webinar today, I'm planning it with roughly 90 minutes, but it might be shorter or a little bit longer depending on how everything goes. Then another thing that I want to mention, and I'll already start sharing my screen now, because that's the point where you are going to follow what I do. Share screen. There you go. So, maybe some of you already saw this repo that's called P1 to P2 upgrade path feedback. In that repo, you can share your questions and issues about your specific upgrade path. And because I've gotten a lot of requests over the past couple of weeks from people who actually want to talk to other people that went through the migration already to hear about their experiences, I think this repo is also a good place for you to just connect. So for everybody who wants to upgrade in the near future or who has already upgraded, feel free to basically use this repo here and the issues as kind of a forum to just share your own experiences. So it's a little bit abusing the idea of a GitHub repo, of course, because we don't really have any source code here and it's not really a project. It's really more for interaction with the community and to have a dedicated place for that. And that's what you can do here. So I encourage everybody to go here, create issues with your questions and with your own experiences and get in touch with other people. So that's one thing. That's how you can connect to other people who are upgrading. And then secondly, I've also heard a lot of folks who need help with the upgrade path. And a lot of people are asking us at Prisma if we can maybe dedicate some time for some consultancy work. Unfortunately, this is not something that is in the realm of our possibilities. So unfortunately, we cannot help individual teams with their upgrade pass on kind of like a consultancy basis. But we have a community member who's called Matic, who is very eager to help people with the upgrade path and the migrations. And he has a ton of experience with all the different iterations of our product. So if you need somebody who really has a lot of expertise in all of these questions, then I would recommend to definitely reach out to Matic and ask him if he can maybe help you with your project. All right, that's what I wanted to say. Before we get into the actual part of today's webinar, I now want to learn a little bit more about your personal setups with Prisma One. And for that, I have prepared a poll here in the Zoom webinar. Matt, I think you in your control panel, you should have a way how you can launch the poll somehow. Is that right?
I do, yeah.
Okay, then can you click launch poll and we all see what happens? I haven't used this functionality yet, so I'm not sure myself. Okay, so the poll popped up for me and I assume for probably everybody else. So please go through it. The first question is, what does your API layer look like? And I assume that most of you will have a GraphQL API, but the way how you can build this GraphQL API with Prisma can vary in a lot of different ways. So it could either be with Prisma binding, that was kind of the very first model when Prisma 1 was released. That's an SDL first approach. You might also use SDL first with Prisma client, which was kind of the successor of Prisma binding. Maybe you choose a code first approach, for example, with Nexus. It could also be a code first approach with type GraphQL or another library. So you can also choose GraphQL, but with a different combo. Or maybe you're building a REST API with Prisma client, or maybe even something else. Then which database do you use with Prisma? MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB. A little bit of info about your upgrade plans. Did you already start the upgrade? When do you want to upgrade? And are you using TypeScript or JavaScript? Matt, do you see any responses coming in actually?
I do, yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm not sure if you can share them, like maybe we can also share them at the end of this, but if everybody could fill out that poll, that would be super helpful. It's always interesting to hear kind of what your setups look like. So that'll definitely be interesting to us. All right, so much for the poll. So let's talk about what we want to cover today in this webinar. So today is going to be actually all about the Prisma layer. So when you're upgrading from Prisma 1 to Prisma 2, you will have to do a number of things where you have to touch your database in order to make the database schema that was created by Prisma 1 in order to make that compatible with Prisma 2. And that's what we're going through today, and where I'm going to explain all the details and kind of nitty-gritty issues that you might encounter during that process. And that means we're not going to talk about the actual application layer. So whatever kind of API you're building and how you're building it is not part of today's webinar, but we might cover that in a future webinar if there is interest. So today is really all about upgrading the Prisma layer from Prisma 1 to Prisma 2. And the way how I want to do this is I want to use the upgrade documentation that we wrote and use this as my own guidance. So I will basically pick kind of an illustrative example of a Prisma 1 project, and then I kind of simulate what the upgrade process should look like if I had to go through the upgrade path with this example. So that already brings me to the first documentation page that I want to discuss with you, and that you should really use as kind of the central point from where you're getting started with your own personal upgrade path, because it's basically a documentation page that tells you the most important things about the upgrade process. So first, it talks a little bit about what kind of upgrade documentation do we actually have. And we have a number of different pages here that you can also see in the site nav. I'll actually increase the font a little bit. So we have the how to upgrade page. That's the starting point. That's what we're looking at right now. Then we have the schema and compatibilities page. We're not going to look at the page today, really, but we're going to encounter a number of the schema and compatibilities, and I'm going to explain them during my own upgrade path. And this page here, so like these two are kind of high-level overviews and explanations, really more conceptual and theoretical, talking about the upgrade process. And then we have like practical guides that walk you through an example scenario of the upgrade process. And there we have the upgrading the Prisma layer. That's this page. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And once you're done with upgrading the Prisma layer, then it's about upgrading your application layer. And depending on what your stack currently looks like and how you want to migrate, you then might choose one of these 4 guides. But that's basically kind of the categorization of these pages that you find here. The first two are very high level. This one is a practical guide that everyone should should go through because you all are using Prisma 1 and have to go to Prisma 2. But then the way how you upgrade your application might differ. So that's where you pick kind of your own adventure. All right, let's talk about the main differences between Prisma 1 and Prisma 2. And I actually want to do a quick yes and no poll. So now you can use your raise hand functionality. So like what I would like to know is who of you already has a good understanding of Prisma 2? Like who has followed kind of what we do, who has used it already? And please leave your hand down if you really have no idea yet about Prisma 2 and how it works and how it compares to Prisma 1. So please use the raise hand functionality. And I currently, for some reason, cannot see the raised hands. That's unfortunate. Matt, can you see them?
Yeah, there's about 9 out of 29 people that have raised their hand. 10
okay.
out of 29 people.
Okay, very good. That means that we have quite a few people that don't really know what Prisma 2 is yet. So hopefully this section in the docs is going to help those people. So very, very briefly, I think the big difference that Prisma 2 brings is that it really just is a database toolkit now and has nothing to do with GraphQL anymore. And the way how you can think about it is just, it's really just another NPM library that you install in your project and that you can use to access your database. There is no database proxy server anymore, so the Prisma server is completely gone. Prisma 2 also makes the features of Prisma 1 more modular and splits them into dedicated tools. So most importantly, we have Prisma Client, which is an improved version of Prisma Client 1.0, and Prisma Migrate, which was formerly done just with the Prisma deploy command. This is now pretty much a standalone tool that you'll be able to use. One note on that, though, is that it's not quite ready yet. We'll talk about that in a second. The Prisma 1 data model and the Prisma YAML that you're all familiar with, they don't exist anymore in Prisma 2, but they have been merged into what's called the Prisma schema file. And you can learn about that in the documentation. And we'll, of course, also see an example later in the webinar. Prisma 2 uses its own modeling language instead of being based on GraphQL SDL. That being said, the modeling language that we are using is very much inspired by SDL, and somebody who already is familiar with writing SDL will have no problem whatsoever picking up our Prisma modeling language. And then another really important point is that Prisma 2, because there is no extra server anymore, it also doesn't expose a GraphQL API for your database. So really, if you think about Prisma 2, don't think about GraphQL in any way anymore, just think about databases. I think that's kind of the most important takeaway. And we invested a lot into the introspection capabilities of Prisma 2. So now you can pretty much connect it to any existing database. And we'll actually make use of introspection throughout the upgrade process quite a bit as well. In terms of feature parity, there are a couple of substantial features that are still missing from Prisma 2. If they are really important for you, then it might be worth to still wait a little bit until you upgrade. So of course, we don't have Prisma Migrate ready yet. For the time being, you will have to pick another kind of migration tool, or you have to run the risk to go with a non-production ready tool for your migrations, which you probably don't want to do in production. Prisma 2 doesn't have a real-time API yet, and quite frankly, it's not clear when we are going to build something like this. But the Prisma client recently introduced a middlewares feature, and that middlewares feature can be used to implement GraphQL subscriptions yourself. So this would be something where you at least have a workaround to implement subscriptions. And we don't have MongoDB support yet, and it's also not 100% clear when it's going to come. You can follow our public roadmap to learn more about this, and the roadmap is linked here from the docs as well. One quick question, Matt, maybe you can quickly answer. I don't see the indication here from Zoom like that I'm sharing my screen, but can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just double checking here because
Right.
I was scared for a second that I'm talking here, showing things, and nobody can actually see what's going on.
Nope, you're good.
All right, then here's a section about the schema incompatibilities, and that's actually what we're going to talk about in detail during the upgrade process. So I'm going to go over this fairly briefly now. The point about these is basically that when you ran Prisma deploy in your Prisma 1 setup, the way how Prisma creates your database schema from your Prisma 1 data model has a couple of quirks. And these quirks are no problem when you are accessing your database exclusively with Prisma 1. But once you introduce another database tool into the mix where you actually want to have kind of the proper representation of things in the database schema, then they lead into issues. And that's what this table is about. And we'll get back to that fairly soon. Same for the upgrade CLI. We're going to use that. So this is a tool that helps you with upgrading the Prisma layer. And in fact, it's also the reason why Matt is right here next to me, because Matt has written the upgrade CLI and will be able to answer all the specific questions that you might have about it. One more important thing is that there are basically two upgrade strategies that you have to pick when you're thinking about upgrading. On the one hand, you could go and upgrade all at once. That means that you would entirely remove Prisma 1 from your project and move everything over to Prisma 2 at once. If you can go with that strategy, that's probably the one that's recommended. But of course, if you already have kind of a live project with a lot of users, then this strategy might not be feasible, and you might have to resort to the gradual side-by-side upgrade path, where you're using Prisma 2 and Prisma 1 in the same project for a certain amount of time. When to choose which strategy, so I just explained that a little bit. And then the upgrade path is, no matter which of these strategies you choose on a high level, the upgrade path basically always follows the same kind of steps. So you have your running Prisma 1 project, you install Prisma 2 CLI, you create your Prisma schema and configure the database connection. You then use the Prisma 2 CLI to introspect your Prisma 1 database and generate your first Prisma schema. Then you use the upgrade CLI to fix the generated Prisma schema. Then you can go and install and generate Prisma client. And finally, you can go and adjust your application code and replace all the API calls from Prisma 1 with those of Prisma 2. And these steps are what we're going to look at today. And this is out of scope for today's webinar. All right, let me quickly take a peek at the Q&A and see if there already have been any questions that are relevant to answer right now. And okay, for some reason, I don't see the Q&A section here in Zoom anymore. Like I lost my Zoom controls here, which is annoying. Matt, is there any question that you think might be? Now my controls are back. I see it. Is the process the same for upgrading Heroku Prisma integration? Yes, the process will be the same no matter where your database or your Prisma server is being hosted. And one note on that, by the way, once you're done with the migration, then you won't even need the Heroku Prisma server anymore, because you don't need a Prisma server at all anymore. So you're basically getting rid of that one component during the upgrade process. All right, then let's go ahead and get started. I prepared a demo project that uses the classic data model of users, posts, profile, and category. And one thing to highlight here already, and that's something that you'll find fairly quickly into your upgrade process, is that once you install kind of the new Prisma extension, you'll get syntax errors in your Prisma 1 data model, because this actually uses Prisma GraphQL syntax. So you can fix this by just adjusting the suffix of the file, I think. It still complains about the directives, not sure. You probably have to register them somewhere, but it already looks a little bit better. What is this project? So we can look at Prisma admin. We have the 4 tables in the database. I have a little bit of sample data, so just so that we have something here. And I can run this, I think, with npm run dev, and we'll get a GraphQL playground where we can send queries. GraphQL playground just caches all my previous queries. Let's see, what do the queries actually look like? Posts, ID, title. Okay, I guess I have an issue here because this has to point to the right project. And it works. We see that we get this data. So that's the project that we want to upgrade today. It uses Prisma binding, but that's kind of irrelevant because we're not talking about the application layer today and are only interested in the first part where we're upgrading the Prisma layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the upgrade documentation with the code here side by side. And then I'll just talk through the different steps and explain what I'm doing. So as I mentioned before, the very first step that you have to go through when you're upgrading is you have to install the Prisma 2 CLI, and that will give you all the tools that you need to get started with Prisma 2 in your project. So I'm just copying the command. And one quick side note, what I already did in this project is I installed the Prisma 1 CLI. So we renamed the Prisma CLI. What you're using at the moment most likely is a CLI that's just called Prisma that you installed with npm install, probably -g globally Prisma. This is deprecated, and instead you should be using Prisma 1 because the Prisma command is now captured by the at Prisma CLI that I just installed. So if I wanted to call this, then I can now invoke the Prisma 2 CLI like this. And one difference also compared to Prisma 1 is that with Prisma 2, we always recommend to install. Did it now actually edit? Oh yeah, it edited here. That we recommend to install the Prisma CLI locally as a development dependency instead of globally, and that's to avoid version conflicts. If you upgrade all in once, you can actually remove the Prisma 1 CLI, but if you are upgrading side by side, then you want to keep it, and I also just keep it here for now. Okay, then the first step and the first thing that you'll need to do is you'll have to create your Prisma schema. The Prisma schema is basically, as I mentioned, a combination of Prisma YAML and the data model that you know from Prisma 1. And if I run this command, then I see an error, and it also says so here, because I already have a folder that's called Prisma. So what I'm going to do, I'll just easily rename that to Prisma 1. And recall the npx prisma init command. And this time it's successful and creates this folder for me. So let's take a quick look at what the Prisma schema actually looks like. This is basically the Prisma configuration. Information like this previously would have lived in Prisma YAML. It specifies which generator we are using. We're using Prisma client.js. Actually, from Prisma 1, you might be used to having the JavaScript and TypeScript generators for Prisma client be separate. That's not the case anymore with Prisma 2. With Prisma 2, we only have this one generator, and that's valid both for TypeScript and for JavaScript. So no matter what you're using, you'll always use this generator. Then we also configure the database connection via an environment variable right here. And that environment variable is configured here. So I'm just going to use the credentials that I have for my local Postgres database. By the way, I also have it open here in Postico. The database is called Prisma. That's probably not very readable for you, I would assume, but it says Prisma. And then the next thing that's important here is the Postgres schema. And that's different in Postgres and in MySQL. In MySQL, you don't have this intermediate layer of a schema. Basically, a schema is a namespace for tables, and you can specify which schema you want to target here at the end. By default, the schema is called public, but in this case, it's called webinar $def. And you will notice that this is named after the service name and stage name. Hey, why is it not opening my Prisma YAML? There you go. It's named after the service name and the stage name of your Prisma 1 URL. If you're using MySQL, then it would actually look like this, because you don't have that schema. You just point to a database. It would basically look like this, and instead of a $, you're using an @ here. But that's also explained down here in the documentation, where it's being explained how you can configure your database URL with a lot of examples and a lot of info. Okay, but this is what my database URL looks like. So I can skip all that part, which was just about determining the connection URL and connecting to the database. I've done that. I've entered my database credentials. So I'm good to move on to the next section. And I already showed you the data model that we're using here. So I can quickly reopen it again. Oops. Prisma 1 data model. So that's the same as here. And like one thing that's interesting about this is the SQL that Prisma 1 created. You will notice that, for example, the JSON data field on the user model right here is of type JSON. And if we look at the user table right here, we see that it's just stored as a text in the database. And the same for the role field, which is supposed to be an enum. And this already hints to what the schema incompatibilities are that I was talking about before. That is that when you're running Prisma deploy and Prisma 1 is reading this data model and generating SQL statements to create the respective tables in your database, then you will lose a little bit of information, because Prisma 1 has a certain way of mapping this data model to SQL. And this, the way how this mapping is performed is not using necessarily a lot of the underlying database functionality, but a lot of that was just implemented by the Prisma server. And that's a problem with Prisma 2, and we'll see right now why. Because the next step that you're going to do now is that you're going to introspect your database. So I configured my database credentials, so Prisma knows about the location of my database now. And now I can run the introspect command. And it says it introspected 4 models, wrote them into my Prisma schema file. It even detected that I want to upgrade and told me that I can read the docs, and also this command that we'll explore in a second. And it also has a couple of more infos here about things that didn't go perfectly well during the introspection. But let's take a look now at my Prisma schema. And the Prisma schema indeed has been updated by the introspection, because we now read the tables from the database, and now we have the schema right here. And we see the same problem that I just pointed out before, that we lost information in that process from mapping the Prisma 1 data model to SQL and then introspecting it with Prisma 2 to generate the Prisma 2 data model. We lost information along the way. For example, if again we look at the user model right here, we have the problem that this is currently categorized as a string, that role is currently categorized as a string, A couple of more things are not ideal about this, and they're all listed here. So at the moment here, we don't have a default value for the role field that we used to have in the Prisma 1 data model. There also are problems with relations. For example, user profile used to be a one-to-one relation, but now one user can have many profiles, and that's not right. So there are a number of issues in general with the way how Prisma introspected and generated this Prisma schema. One thing that I want to point out, though, is that this is not a major deal breaker. I mean, you still have the right functionality here, right? I mean, you can now basically generate your Prisma client based on this data model, and you'll still be able to get in the data into the database that you need. But of course, you're losing certain constraints, certain guarantees. For example, because JSON data is just noded as a string, in the generated Prisma client API later on, you will be able to store any string inside of the JSON data fields, but then of course losing any validation that this string actually is JSON. And the same with the kind of relation here, where before it was guaranteed by Prisma that one user could only have one profile and one profile could only have one user. And that guarantee also is gone. So basically things are still possible, but you lose certain constraints, lose certain guarantees that you would expect from your database layer. And that's what's explained in detail on the schema incompatibilities page, and what we are going to resolve now using the upgrade CLI. The way how the upgrade CLI works is in a very, very flexible way, basically. You can, and that I want to say up front, you can basically start it and stop it and restart it at any time in your upgrade process. So there really is no need to go through it at once, but you can just explore, see how it works, click through it a little bit, and then understand and really how it works, and then over time you can actually go and resolve these incompatibilities. In general, what the upgrade CLI actually does, it generates SQL statements that help me resolve these issues right here. For example, it will generate a SQL statement that I can send to the database that is turning the type of the underlying JSON data column from a text into a JSON type, so that on the database level, we're actually making sure that we're storing JSON data, and so that when we reintrospect the database with Prisma 2, that this will actually be properly categorized as JSON. And because we have a number of these schema incompatibilities, and the type mismatch here is just an example, the Prisma upgrade CLI basically takes care of all of these different incompatibilities for you, so that you don't have to write and figure out all these complex SQL statements. So in general, the way how the upgrade flow works is that you start by running the Prisma upgrade CLI, and the upgrade CLI will kind of compare your current database schema, the actual SQL schema, with your Prisma schema, and it'll generate the right SQL statements for you to fix the issue. So you run this command and it sends you a number of SQL statements back. What you're doing is you're taking those SQL statements and you're sending those to your database yourself. So one important note is that the upgrade CLI is never going to touch your database. It's not even aware of where your database is actually located, or it probably is, I don't know, but it's never going to send any SQL to your database. It just reads kind of the database schema from it. So that's how you can start resolving these incompatibilities. Whenever you're done with that phase, you can run Prisma introspect again, and you'll notice that a few things will be resolved here. So that, for example, if you sent the SQL statement that turned the text into a JSON column, then in another introspection run, this will actually come out as JSON here instead of string. So that's kind of the goal, that we want to ensure that the right things are being read from the database and put into the Prisma schema. So Prisma introspect reads your database schema. The database schema is sent back to the CLI, and the CLI writes the data, the respective Prisma models into your Prisma 2 schema. We already saw that, how that worked. And in the end, you run the Prisma upgrade tool again to add the missing attributes that were not part of the database schema. All right, then I think we can start with this. In fact, I quickly want to see, are there any questions about the upgrade CLI specifically? There is one question from Jesper. If I'm still on Prisma 1 pre-130, should I upgrade to the latest Prisma 1 before going to Prisma 2, or is it going from 129 directly from Prisma 2 viable? That's a good question. So in version 130 of Prisma, we introduced a new data model syntax. And I think that's indeed relevant for a lot of people who might not have updated. We had a blog post about this a while ago. This was it, last year, where we introduced this new data model v1.1, and that was introduced in Prisma version 130, I think. But regardless whether you're below or higher than version 130, you can directly update to Prisma 2. It's not necessary to first upgrade to the data model v1.1. It might help, but it's not necessary for sure. Then another question from Jesper. Can Prisma upgrade remove the I guess many-to-many table created from one-to-one relationships in Prisma 1? Yes, it can, but this is a change that is breaking your Prisma 1 schema. So if you're running Prisma 1 and Prisma 2 side by side, then you won't be able to do this, and you have to kind of accept that you're losing the constraint of Prisma ensuring that you have a one-to-one relation, and instead have a little bit more responsibility to manage that relation yourself, ensuring that you don't put more data into it.
And Nico, one other question that came in the chat. Do you know, can you remind us where the mathematic comment is? Because somebody's looking for, and I couldn't find it. Yeah.
Right, I've got the link here. It's in the Prisma discussions. I can also actually just like drop it in the chat.
Yeah, that would be great.
List, chat. There you go. Cool. Then I'm ready to run the upgrade CLI. Matt, let's see your work. I'm just copying this. I'm passing the path to the Prisma YAML from Prisma 1 and to my new Prisma schema. And so I haven't installed it explicitly in my project. I'm just like running it like on a one-off, in a one-off way, basically, using npx. Wait, what? I am in the right directory now. Because I renamed it.
Yeah.
I'm renaming it back just because I didn't test it with the renamed version. So just like this, data model.prisma. We'll see the errors again. I'm just closing it. All right. Sorry about that. Let's try it again.
It actually doesn't matter, but you just needed to update the prisma.yaml to point to the new version.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I could have done this as well. All right, this is a lot of text. We don't really have to read it right now just because you can read it on your own time later if you're interested, but it's also just basically what I already explained. We're like never touching your database. This is the steps that we already talked about. So let's jump right in and just go ahead and see what the tool does next for us. That's a little bit of an issue with my terminal, but I think, yeah, like this it should work. So it now prints this statement here, adjust your database schema. And that's exactly what I explained before. We have to go into our database to resolve these schema incompatibilities. And the way how it's structured here is that it's going to spit out the SQL statements kind of by category, by schema incompatibility. And each of these schema incompatibilities is again linked to the documentation. So if I click on this, but it's not, enums are represented as text in the database. Well, it should link me directly to that. I think that's an issue in the docs that we should fix. But yeah, it links directly to a section in the docs on the schema incompatibilities page. And it explains the individual problem here, basically, right? So let's go through this one as an example. The problem here is that Prisma 1 supports the enum data type in the data model. However, in the underlying database, types declared as enum are actually stored as plain strings using the text data type of the underlying database. That's what we already saw before. And any validation of the stored enum data is done by the Prisma server at runtime in Prisma 1. So in Prisma 1, it's no problem that we are storing this as text because the validation is done by the Prisma server. But in Prisma 2, we don't have a Prisma server. We don't have that extra validation. We need a more direct representation of the enum in the database. So here's an example, the same one that we're actually using ourselves. So if we have this data model with a role enum, then what's getting created in the database is just this role text. We don't have any additional context. And so if you introspect it with Prisma 2, what you'll get is a role string here, which is not accurate. So as a workaround, here is what you can do. You can run these SQL statements and reintrospect, and then this will be properly recognized by Prisma 2. So let's see the SQL statements that were generated here. And I'm just actually copying them and trusting Matt that he did a good job here. And so far, I think he very much has. And copying them into Postico. So we are creating an enum, and then we are setting the type of the role column to the enum that we just created. So I'm going to execute both of them. And if we go into the user table and we look at the structure, then we can already see that the role here is now its own type. It's not text anymore, but it's its own type. And to illustrate already what I meant with the flow that you can stop the upgrade CLI at any point and then restart and introspect, and you can do that basically in your own kind of tempo. I just want to show you how that works in practice. So I just quit the upgrade CLI with Control-C. I'll rerun it. I'll go and reintrospect. So I'm skipping to this step now. npx Prisma introspect. Running the introspection again, and hopefully let me reopen the schema. And now the role right here has been changed to an enum that was created. So it works when we now step by step go into the database and kind of make the things proper, like in the way that they should be represented in the database, so that Prisma 2 introspection is able to pick them up. All right, for the next one, I'll just go through the remaining SQL statements. So again, running the upgrade CLI. yes, we want to continue to the next step. And the SQL statements, we already see that the upgrade tool is smart. It saw that this is not a problem anymore. The enum is not a problem anymore. So we don't have this SQL statement being printed anymore. So the next problem is that of missing default constraints in the database. So if we look, for example, at the Prisma 1 data model that we used to have here, data model.prisma, we had two default attributes, one for the role field on user and one for the published field on post. But if we look at the database schema for these two, then for example, on the post field, if we look at the published field, there is no default. So again, the default here was implemented by Prisma, by the Prisma server, and the default value was inserted into the database at runtime. But the fact that there was a default value for this field, for this column in the database, was not actually represented inside of the database. So that's what we're going to fix next with the SQL statements generated by the upgrade CLI. For both cases, I just copy this. There you go. Here I can send my SQL query again. Send these two, and if we go back to post and refresh, now we do have the default value right here. So if I now would go back again, I would quit the upgrade CLI and reintrospect. Then, because the default values now manifest in the database, they would show up in my Prisma schema as well if I reintrospect it now. But I'm not doing that now, I'm doing it later, and I'll just continue going through these different schema incompatibilities. And by the way, each of these incompatibilities is also listed here. So really, step by step, we are taking you by your hand, going through all of these different issues that you need to fix. So the next one is fix the columns with JSON data types. So like that's the example that I mentioned in the beginning. The JSON data column is currently text, but we want it to be JSON. So let's go ahead, open Postico, execute, and going to the user, we now see that JSON data has been changed from text to JSONB as we wanted it. Created at, the created at behavior had the same problem in Prisma. It was implemented by the Prisma server and not visible in the database. So to fix that, we have this one SQL query right here to set a default value on the created at column for the current timestamp. This one is interesting, fix one-to-one relations by adding unique constraints. So I mentioned before that in our current Prisma 2 schema, we used to have a one-to-one relation in Prisma 1 between user and profile, but now one user can have many profiles. And the reason for that is that post and user, here profile and user are just connected via a single foreign key on profile. And if Prisma 2 introspection sees a pattern like this, where you have a foreign key on a table that points to another table, it will automatically turn it into a one-to-many relation. So how can you stop it from doing that? Well, in order to prevent that, you can make this foreign key unique. And that's exactly the SQL statement that's printed by the upgrade CLI. It adds a unique constraint to this column in order to make sure that there can always only be one profile record that is associated with the same user. If we didn't have that unique constraint, you could create multiple profile records that all were pointing to the same user record, therefore making a one-to-many relation instead of a one-to-one relation. So here we go. I'm executing the statement, and we now have a unique constraint on user. And finally, we need to make a change to the CUID length. This is a little bit more involved. I'm not going to talk about this in detail now, but it's also just something that's required when you upgrade. All right, that's pretty much it. It says breaking changes detected. We'll talk about that in a second. For now, I just want to show you where we are at the moment. In fact, I'm just going to cancel again and run Prisma introspect. Let's take a look at the schema. All right, looks much better, doesn't it? We now have default values. User and profile actually do have a one-to-one relation, not a one-to-many relation anymore. JSON has the JSON fields. What else was there? Created at has the default value for now. So a couple of really helpful things have been done already. And now it's the part where I can run the upgrade CLI again. And no SQL statements will be printed, but instead I'll just see the note about breaking changes. Actually, this, maybe I didn't send it properly. But in any case, it says breaking changes detected. In order to fully optimize your database schema, you'll need to run a few SQL statements that will break your Prisma 1 setup. Note that these changes are optional, and if you're upgrading gradually and running Prisma 1 and Prisma 2 side by side, you should not perform these changes yet. Instead, you can perform them whenever you're ready to completely remove Prisma 1 from your project. If you're upgrading all at once, you can safely perform these changes now. So in my context here in this demo, I can, of course, run them, but I quickly also want to go back to the how to upgrade page and the table right here to quickly explain a little bit what that table means. We have basically three, or like here we have the different schema incompatibilities, and we talked about a number of them. For example, default values aren't represented in the database, or created at isn't represented in the database, or JSON type is represented as text. These were the things that we just fixed. So the SQL column just specifies whether there is a workaround with SQL to fix this issue. And in fact, we were using the SQL workarounds, right? We were using a SQL statement to make sure that default values are represented in the database. We used a SQL statement to change the JSON from text to JSON, or the same for from text to specific enums. So there are workarounds for these problems in SQL if it says yes here. Some of them only have workarounds in the Prisma schema. And in fact, you don't have to care much about them because they will all be taken care for you by the upgrade CLI. But for example, updated at isn't represented in the database. There is no SQL statement that you can send to the database to resolve this issue. But what you can do is you can manually insert the updated at attribute into your Prisma schema. So at the moment, this field is just a plain datetime field. There is no specific behavior, but you could now go and add updated at to this field in order to resolve that schema incompatibility. But you don't have to do that manually because that's the last step in the Prisma upgrade CLI that we'll see later. And then the last column says breaking Prisma 1, and that's indeed just showing which of these SQL statements are breaking Prisma 1. And it's literally just this one schema incompatibility. The fact that relation tables in Prisma 1 are always, or that in Prisma 1, we always used relation tables to represent relations, even for one-to-one and one-to-many relations. And so in Prisma 2, what's going to happen, all of these relation tables will be interpreted as many-to-many relations. And that's the only thing that you won't be able to to fix really if you're running side by side, and you'll have to accept that if you're using the Prisma 2 client, it sees all your one-to-one and one-to-many relations as many-to-many relations. So much for the context. So let's see the breaking SQL statements. And this is what it looks like. Let's go back to the upgrade process where it's also explained what exactly is going to happen. So first, here's a section again about the breaking changes, explaining what it means. That's pretty much what I just did. And then fix the incorrect many-to-many relations. So if you're able to do that, then you have to run through these 3 steps, basically. And to actually illustrate the problem, I quickly just want to show you in the database again, the structure. Also opening the Prisma 1 data model again. So we have this example here of users and posts, which is a one-to-many relation. One post has one user as its author, and one user can have many posts. So this is a one-to-many relation, but because it says relation link table, this was introduced in the data model v1.1, by the way. So here, if you're already on v1.1 and you're using inline here, then you're much better off, because then you're just using a foreign key for the relation and not a relation table. But in this case, we're basically using the approach that was taken in the data model v1.1. So for all Prisma versions lower than 130, all relations will be represented as relation tables. So this relation table here holds the data for all my user post relations. And that's the reason why it's recognized in my Prisma 2 schema as a many-to-many relation. At the moment, one post can have many users, and one user can have many posts. So it's a many-to-many, and that's just because Prisma sees this, like Prisma 2 sees this relation table and reads it as a many-to-many relation into the schema. So what we have to do is we have to somehow delete this table and make sure that we take the data that we currently have here and create a new foreign key column on the post table that we can then use to point to the right user records. If we can make that change and only represent the relation with a single foreign key instead of a relation table, then Prisma 2 introspection will be able to understand that this is a one-to-many relation and not a many-to-many relation. So let's look at the SQL that was generated for that. And I think Matt really outdid himself here with the generated SQL statements. So I'm not sure if I were able to write these statements by hand even. What it does exactly what I just talked about, right? It adds a new column that's called author ID to the post table. Then it basically reads the post IDs and the user IDs from the relation table and puts the data from the relation table into the new foreign key column. And finally just drops the post to user relation table. So let me run this, refresh Postico, and we already see that the post to user relation table is removed. So let's also validate that we have a new column here that's author ID, and it even has the right values and points to the respective user records, right? So that worked, and we now basically resolved that last schema incompatibility. And if we reintrospect now, which I'm going to do, then we'll see that this is now a one-to-many relation, just as it should be. Great. So far, so good. That means you can go ahead and reintrospect your database, and we just did that. And our Prisma schema now looks pretty good. So it has a lot more information or more concrete information. It enforces the same constraints that were present in your Prisma 1 data model. So it really looks a lot better, but there still are a couple of smaller issues. And that's about the missing attributes. So before I already talked about the updated attribute, but another thing in Prisma 2 that you have to do when you want to have default values for IDs, for example, you will have to specify how you want to go and generate your default values. And because in Prisma 1 we've been using CUIDs, you probably want to do this for all of your ID fields. But again, because you don't have to do that manually, similar to the updated you don't have to do that, but the Prisma upgrade CLI is going to take care of that for you. So I'm going to run the upgrade CLI again. All right, and here it also says or explains again in the docs that like which attributes are going to be added. If you're using map and or @map and @db or @db in Prisma 1, then this is also going to be mapped to the @map and @map versions from Prisma 2. All right, so
sorry, one thing to call out there, you may have seen that the IDs were asked again, and unfortunately we can't figure out just from the two schemas themselves what this adjustment. So we're basically like, if you see that, if you've already run those alter IDs, you can ignore that going forward.
Good to know, thanks. So it says here now, so of course we don't have any SQL statements left. So this section is now empty. And what happens next? As a last step, some final adjustments will be made to your Prisma 2 schema to carry over some Prisma level attributes that aren't picked up by introspection. The current Prisma 2 schema will be overwritten. Make sure you have a backup in case you had any important information there. For me, that's not the case. So I'm just going to go ahead. And it wraps up with this final note. If you didn't execute all generated SQL statements against your database, you can just rerun the upgrade CLI again at any time. And I have to reopen a Prisma schema. This was an issue. Okay, I'll look at that afterwards. First, let's see what happened. And indeed, the default CUID values have been added and the updated has been added. Now we have all of this. And actually, one piece of functionality that is already baked into the upgrade CLI now, where here it's still manual in the docs, so we need to update the documentation here, is that the relation fields that previously were just mapped to the model name from introspection, they are actually also changed. So it was not only that in the last step, the upgrade CLI added these attributes, it also renamed the relation fields to the same names they had in the Prisma 1 data model. So this is now called author again, this is called posts again, where before this was called user, and this was just called post. So this is very nice. Here's one issue.
I think it's a slight bug. I think you just need to change fields to user ID. Yep.
Ah, right.
Yep.
Perfect. Yes, so far so good. We have our final version of the Prisma schema. And that means you can go ahead and generate Prisma client, which is going to be your main tool for the next part of your upgrade process when you're upgrading your application layer. And to maybe very quickly just show you how you can use Prisma client. If you haven't seen it at all before, I can quickly I'll just use it in a script here. and just quickly show you what you can now do with this. Add Prisma client. So what Prisma client is, it's basically a sort of query builder, a database client that you can use inside your Node.js and TypeScript application. So the same as Prisma Client 1, but it really gets a lot closer to the database since we removed the intermediate Prisma server and that GraphQL layer in between. So you instantiate it like this. In fact, actually, I'll just make an async main function here that I can call. And await or const users. And here is how you can now use Prisma client to work with your database. So on your Prisma client instance, you have properties for each model. So for example, if I wanted to query users, then I can say .user, and now I have all the CRUD operations that I can send right here. So let's maybe just start with a simple find many for all users that we're going to log. Async function main. And npm run dev. It just prints the users that we have in the database. And in the same way, you can just go ahead now and use create queries or whatever other query you want to add. One thing I want to point out that was requested by Dennis, I think he's also on the call here right now, kind of a high-level comparison of Prisma 1 and Prisma 2. And we added that to our documentation today. So if you're curious, just if you're used to seeing this code here, prisma.user, users, and you're kind of wondering what is the equivalent in Prisma 2, you'll find the Prisma 2 version here side by side. So it really, it's not very detailed, but at least on a high level, I think it can already give a good idea of how the two APIs actually differ. All right, we are done with everything that I wanted to show. So I think we can go ahead and pick a number of questions. And I see that Matt was already quite at work responding to most of these questions, so that's great. We currently have 2 open questions, and I'm just going to read them out loud here. So one is the one from Chris Allen. I'm attempting my upgrade next week. Is this an issue in the P1 to P2 upgrade path feedback repo the best place to seek guidance if it's needed? Yes, I would say so. So I really want to make that repo kind of the central point where everybody who is currently working on a migration or planning to migrate, where all of these people come together and can exchange their experiences. Of course, we'll also try to keep an eye on it. But I'm not sure how much actual support we'll be able to deliver there. If you find issues with the upgrade CLI, then for sure go ahead and open an issue in the upgrade repo. It's just called Prisma Upgrade, and I think Matt is checking that still fairly regularly. So if you have an issue with the tool itself, then go ahead and create an issue here. If you have broad questions, and want to find an exchange with other community members, then go ahead and use the issues here. Then another question by Maxime. My app is quite old and currently uses a mixture of Prisma Binding and Prisma Client. Is it recommended to migrate to Nexus while migrating to Prisma 2? That is certainly a consideration. And in general, I would say yes. So if you want to upgrade a GraphQL app that you currently have running on Prisma 1, no matter what kind of stack it uses, I think migrating to Nexus will be a good choice. There are a couple of limitations with the Nexus framework at the moment. For example, you can't deploy it to serverless environments. It doesn't work with plain JavaScript. And I'm not sure how high these specific issues are on the list of the Prisma Labs team. So if you want to be super safe, then I would almost recommend to upgrade to just Nexus schema, which is basically just a library component within the Nexus framework. And that might be a little bit better, but you can also upgrade to Nexus framework. There won't be a big difference. Christoph Oberhofer. Once again, following up on the DB upgrade path, the idea of cloning the production database might only work with a very long maintenance window. What's the main issue when simply reusing the same SQL statements that were used to upgrade the local database? We currently use a Prisma deploy with migrations enabled. This way our tests and production DB should be exactly the same, or am I missing something? Yeah, it's my understanding as well, but Matt, like maybe you want to speak to it.
Yeah, I answered the first part of this. I think this is totally fine. It's just the concern is basically like, are they the same or are there slight variations? If there are possibly slight variations, then you may just want to run the upgrade tool twice, one on the local or staging environment and then one on the production. But totally to minimize the long maintenance window, you probably do just want to, like, assuming they're the same, you probably just want to run a script and just like of the upgrade, of the generated upgrade script.
Yeah. Perfect. Then another question from Jesper. Can you still pass an info object into Prisma 2 queries? That's a very common question, and the answer to that is no. The new Prisma client has no specific API for any sort of GraphQL queries whatsoever. It really is a generic database client with no specific ties to GraphQL. That being said, it allows for you to do field selection. So if you say you have kind of like a user that you that you want to send a find many query for, but you don't want to get full user objects, but you just want to have the ID and the name fields, and maybe include also the author of the posts. Yeah, so you include the posts and then the author. Whether that query actually makes sense or not, that's debatable, probably a bit of a contrived example, but it just goes to show that you can select specific fields from the database, of course, with Prisma Client. And because GraphQL allows you to specify certain fields in your GraphQL queries, it would be nice if we also only fetched those fields from the database, right? And that can be achieved by kind of passing on the info object to Prisma, but in Prisma 2, that's not possible anymore. But that's the point where I want to draw attention to a community project that's built by a very active community member who built a tool called Prisma Select. And that solves exactly that use case. So you install it in your project, then you use the Prisma Select constructor here, and then you're taking the info object, you're converting that into an object that maps to the structure to the select object that's expected by the Prisma 2 client. And you basically get the same benefits that you used to get with Prisma 1 and Prisma Binding before. So while it's not part of the native Prisma 2 client API, it's certainly possible to still get the same benefits. Next question from Kirill. I think I've seen that transactions are more complete in Prisma 2. So my main use case would be to use transactions with Prisma 2 and keep my existing Prisma 1 code base while we finally have time to rewrite the queries. Am I mistaken about transactions? I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, what this means exactly, but I can speak a little bit to transaction support in Prisma 2. So we don't really have an API for folks to have long-running transactions where in the traditional sense, you basically open a connection to the database, and then you can use that connection to send a number of queries, perform calculations, and then at an arbitrary point, stop the transactions and commit it, basically. So we don't have that kind of API, but if you go into this GitHub issue here, I'll also drop it in the chat. You'll find a lot of information around the current transaction support and the future transaction support of Prisma. So maybe that helps clarify that question. Next question from Dennis. Will I be able to dump the Prisma 1 DB and restore to the migrating DB if I don't make the breaking change? My concern is not taking the production DB down during migration to prevent inconsistent data. Matt, do you have any insights on this? I'm not sure, to be honest.
Reading it. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So dumping the Prisma 1 DB into like schema, SQL file, and then restore to the migrating DB if I don't. Yeah, that would work. You just need to make sure that you also dump the data as well, not just the structure or the schema. But yeah, it'd be like making a backup.
All right, and like you can also follow up on that on Slack, Dennis. We can maybe have a follow-up conversation. All right, last question, and then we're done. Cascading deletes not available in Prisma 2. Is this being worked on, or is this something we would have to handle completely on our own in custom resolvers, etc.? Yes, so we don't have support for cascading deletes in the Prisma schema at the moment, that's correct. But you can use cascading deletes basically in two different ways. Either you can configure them yourself on the database level, and we do have guides for doing that, where it's really explained in detail kind of how you set them, what the respective behavior is for the cascading deletes that you configure. So you could either do that, or pointing again to a tool that Ahmed wrote. There should be on delete, and I think this might be helpful because this basically implements the cascading deletes on the Prisma level as well. So feel free to check that out if you want to use cascading delete, as it's not supported natively by Prisma, but there are these two kind of workarounds either on the database level or using the tool from Ahmed. All right, that I think were all the questions. We made it a little bit under 90 minutes. Thank you all for joining today, and looking forward to seeing you around in the community. Matt?
One thing is, do you want to share the polls?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that ended up, I said sharing poll results, but I'm not sure what that did.
Yeah, well, actually, at least I can see them here. So like maybe
Okay.
I'll just like quickly talk through them.
Yeah.
What does your API layer look like? 45% are actually using Prisma binding. Then 24% are using Prisma client with SDL first. So SDL first definitely is predominant here among the folks in this webinar. Then a couple of people are using Nexus, even type GraphQL, 2 people, GraphQL with a different combo, 2 people. Nobody is building REST APIs in this group, but somebody built something else. Majority of users, 69% are using Postgres, a quarter of folks are using MySQL, and 7% are using MongoDB. When do people want to upgrade? So 5 people, 17% of the group already started. 24% want to start as soon as possible. 30% want to start once Prisma Migrate is ready. And 28% say that they want to migrate whenever and are not in a rush. So consequently, 28% already started with the upgrade and 72% did not. And in terms of JavaScript versus TypeScript, we have 66% of JavaScript users and 34% of TypeScript users in this group. Thank you for sharing this. It's always insightful to learn what our users are actually using and how they're building applications. So that's very helpful. All right, then I'll let you all go into your well-deserved weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.